All right. So today we have Facts About Slavery Never Mentioned in School by Thomas Sowell. Let's have at it. This excerpt is taken from the book Black Rednecks and White Liberals: Untold Facts About Slavery.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the
I don't think that's what they teach. I don't think they teach slavery grew out of racism. In the United States, after a certain point in time, that's what it became because of how they seen their slaves who were chattel slavery. So that's less than human. Actually, that's less than the cattle. That's actually less than the actual cattle that they did have at that time. I think chattel slavery was the lowest form of a slave because not only are you dehumanized, but you're also now minimized to an object, really an animal. They call black people animals, and but right.
history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean.
World's first city emerges in Mesopotamia. Land ownership, the early stages of technology bring war in which enemies are captured, forced to work, aka slavery. Let's see, when was the first ship arrived in North America? In the aftermath of the Black Plague, Europe's slave trade thrives in response to a labor shortage. Slaves pour in from all over the continent, the Middle East, North Africa. Let's see. West Africa establishes the Atlantic slave trade. Spanish explorers bring the first African slaves to settlements in what would become the United States. These first African Americans staged the first known slave revolt in the Americas, and that's 1526. Oh Lord, hold up. In 1550, slaves are depicted as objects of conspicuous consumption in much Renaissance art. Massachusetts becomes the first British colony to legalize slavery. Age of abolition. Yeah, I think that's whenever yeah, when they started dismantling it.
People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved.
So this was all a result of war. If you're fond on history somewhat, even if you watch the medieval movies, where you had your knights in way before then, right? 300, Sparta. Um, especially predating that. If you were the losing side in a war, you got what came with that. That was the result of losing. the winner took whatever they wanted, whether it be your children, your wife, you, right? If you were one of the ones fighting, usually the men in the army would get killed because they would pose the most threat. And sometimes they would take them slaves. But they took the women, the children, the goods that were left behind, anything that they can use, supplies. That was a result of war. Now you also have to take into account and consideration who was around them because they went to war with their neighboring villages, factions, organizations, their neighboring tribes. That's who they went to war with because that's who were around them whenever they were expanding to conquer. Even in the biblical days, if you were the losing side of a war, you would become a slave. Now, to what extent of a slave, there's different forms, the lowest being chattel. I don't know, but I guess it was whatever they chose fit, depending on the actual culture or tribe that would sacrifice you.
Enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying.
Yeah, so I read something that said the Africans who were along the bank, they would find those vulnerable, capture them, and then send them off. But this story right here is interesting in its own. All right. When the musical film Black is King was released in 2020, African audiences and some critics said it defamed and distorted the continent's culture and history. Directed and written by American singer Beyonce, who was also its executive producer, Black is King is described by Disney, on whose platform it can be streamed, as a project aimed at highlighting the beauty of tradition and Black excellence and honoring the voyages of Black families throughout time. Their homie was wealthy and it thrived on selling slaves to European traders. King Jesu, who ruled the kingdom between 1818 and 1858, explicitly said that the slave trade was the source and the glory of his people's wealth. They dropped a movie about that.
Off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making.
But what are the objections, though? Like, just because he made a movie about it, I believe that that movie was still very much so PG esque in compared to what the horrors that really took place in the United States, in the Caribbeans. I feel like that's sort of disingenuous because just because he made a movie about it, it doesn't undermine everything that happened. And although everybody has been enslaved, it doesn't mean that what happened in the States was any less than what it was, a hell. It was another layer of hell for our ancestors. For those people back in that day, it was another layer of hell, right? Because you're not even looked at as a human. You're literally looked at as the lowest thing in the on planet Earth at that point.
Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical.
I read something that said that the crew members were dying at a rate of 213 per thousand, and our ancestors were dying at an average rate of 85 per thousand. Not necessarily sure what those statistics were based off, what that data was based off of, if it was just sicknesses or if that counted the ones who were killed on board or, you know, for being thrown over.
Diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there? But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was.
So it says it made them unaware that was the beginning of their troubles. Think about that. All this has happened before they even hit the slave ship. All this happened before. Let me show you something. Look at this. For the captive Africans aboard a slave ship, the voyage to the New World was a passage of nearly unimaginable horror. For most captives, the separation from their villages and families was still fresh, which happened before, and now they were thrust into a hostile and alien world at the mercy of people who were like none they had ever seen before. On boarding, they were stripped of their belongings, branded. You all know what it's like to be branded? You ever burned yourself? Not with hot metal. You know, you ever just accidentally touch something hot, spill hot coffee on you? You ever been branded after going through all the hell that they just imagined? And now you're finally purchased and they put you on a ship and then chained and sent below decks where they would be forced to remain for most of the month's long journey. The slave deck itself was a living nightmare. To the slave traders, these human beings were cargo, and slave ships were especially designed to transport as many captives as possible, with little regard for either their health or their humanity. Slave decks were often only a few feet high, and the African captives were shackled together, lying down, side by side, head to foot, or even closer. Deaths from suffocation, malnutrition, and disease were routine on the slave deck, as were arbitrary torture and, and murder by the crew. Arbitrary. The term arbitrary describes a course of action or a decision that is not based on reason or judgment, but on personal will or discretion without regard to rules or standards. An arbitrary decision is one made without regard for the facts, circumstances presented. Arbitrary torture and murder by the crew. I find it interesting how those are two totally different verbiages. The closeness, the filth, and the fear delivered many into madness, and suicide attempts were common. Other ships could smell slavers from far away, and the Portuguese sailors called them floating tombs. This was a child. This is the statement from a child who was taken from the village, who was on one of these slave ships where they just came out of a horror into an even darker horror.
With some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners.
Yeah, it was a big
Although most black owners of slaves in the United
man, I heard some facts about slavery, especially after they invented the cotton wheel. I believe that's what it's. Let's see. This is why they fought so hard to keep slavery going. Once the cotton gin came into effect, the numbers from cotton production went from hundreds of thousands to millions to millions. And this was just over 60 years. The increase in the U.S. slave population, millions following the cotton gin. Slaves went up to 4 mil. Cotton went from 7%, 58. That's why they went to war. That's why they went to war. It's about money. They were becoming too powerful because they were cheating people. An inhumane process in a modern era. Interesting.
States were only nominal owners of members of their own families. There were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts.
That's interesting. So look at this, right? This is a viral post, and you'll see why. At the peak of slavery in 1860, only 1.4% of Americans owned slaves. What your history books doesn't tell you is that 3,000 blacks owned a total of 20,000 slaves the same year. Proud Southern deplorable, Southern rebel. If you're sick of the race baiting, please like and share. So they decided to take a closer look, and look at what they found. The primary source of data about slaves and slaveholding in 1860 is that year's census. Census data from 1860 isn't perfect, said University of North Carolina historian Joseph T. Glather. author of Soldiering in the Army of North Virginia, a statistical portrait of the troops who served under Robert E. Lee. Sorry if I butchered this last name, but it remains the best evidence we have. Let's go. In the big picture, the 1860 census counted a total of 31,443,321 people, of which 3.9 million, or round off, 4 million were slaves. So slaves accounted for 12.6% of the national population. 0.4% of Americans owned slaves, but slaves accounted for 12.6 of the population. So let's get into how many people were black who owned slaves. 3,000 blacks owned a total of 20,000 slaves the same year. It says we were unable to find hard data to debunk or support this figure. The most solid data we found was published in an article in The Root by Henry Louis Gates Jr., a Harvard University historian. Gates cited research by Carter G. Woodson, an African American historian who died in 1950. He found that in 1830, a total of 3,776 free Negroes owned 12,907 slaves, 30 years before 1860. With 3 more decades of population growth, it's plausible that the number of black owned slaves could have grown to 20,000 by 1860, historians told us. I'd imagine that the 20,000 figure quoted in the meme is probably not that far off from being true, said Junius Rodriguez. Sorry if I know I'm saying it wrong, so I apologize. A Eureka College historian and author of Slavery in the United States, a social, political, and historical encyclopedia. But 20,000 but the 20,000 number is not necessarily as eye-popping as the meme makes it out to be. For starters, even if the number is accurate, it would still account for just a tiny percentage of all slaves held in the United States in 1860, specifically 0.5%. That runs contrary to the post's frame. That's a very small number compared to Latin American or Caribbean societies, says Stephanie McCurry, Columbia University historian and author of Confederate Reckoning: Power and Politics in the Civil War South. In addition, the figure is almost certainly inflated by a legal quirk in the most antebellum southern states. It includes many owned family members whom they had purchased to become free, said Eric Fauner, a Columbia University historian and the author of such books as The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln, and American Slavery. You cannot free a slave in most southern states without sending them out of the state. Gates, writing in The Root, noted that the late historian Thomas J. Presley used Woodson's statistics for 1830 to determine that about 42% of these black slaveholders owned just one slave. To Gates, this suggests that many, though hardly all, black slaveholders legally needed to own a family member, such as a wife or child. Dang, they need to own their own family to. In many instances, the husband purchased the wife or vice versa. Slaves of Negroes were in some cases the children of a free father who had purchased his wife. If he did not thereafter emancipate the mother, as so many such husbands failed to do, his own children were born his slaves and were thus reported to the numerators. In other cases, Woodson wrote, benevolent Negroes often purchased slaves to make their lot easier by granting them their freedom for a normal sum or by permitting them to work it out on liberal terms. This isn't so black and white as they try to make it seem, but like I said, not just because it's thousands doesn't mean that it even put a dent in the population who owned slaves. And clearly, even if you look at what people often get wrong is the term Uncle Tom. It's not Uncle Tom, it's Sambo, but they use it as a synonym for coon. This lady here, a white woman, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom is the protagonist. Sambo is the antagonist. That's where you get the slave owners who were harsh on black people, or the individuals working under the slave master who were more harsh than the slave master or the overseer. For some reason, they hated black people way more than the actual slave owners did. They actually had an inherent hate for them, and they one upped the slave master in most cases. So, no, not everybody is on team with this. But also, from the research that we just read, a lot of people had to own slaves because that was the only way they could keep their family together. Because if that property is free, guess what? Somebody's going to take it. Or they had to get their family from another plantation. Think about that.
An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense.
Not after the 19th century. They were the British was all over that like an ant pile. They was snuffing it out. I mean, where they could, but they was snuffing it out.
No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle.
I beg to differ. Saint Domingue, following the 1804 Haitian massacre, they gained their independence. I believe the now known Haiti, formerly known as Saint Domingue, was the first to actually change the tide. But we all see how that played out for them, unfortunately.
History is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. I'm gonna do a reaction to Dan Carlin's 5.3 hour human resources blitz documentary that he did on slavery. That is one of the most insightful, in-depth fields I have ever experienced listening to someone citing resources and references with that kind of information. That's insane. But yeah, fellow explorers, until next time, adventure safe.